This is Robin Hanson, Professor of Economics at George Mason University, and I'm going to talk to you now about Who Vouches for You, a radical crime law proposal. So law is an industry like lots of other industries, like food, music, movies, furniture, housing, transportation, education, etc. Many industries are dominated more by government in that government provides them more, like, say, the military, sometimes medicine. And law today is dominated by the government, and the government does most things in law. But even today, there are many things government doesn't do. We have private lawyers, private investigators. And in history, a lot of organizations besides government have provided law, including government and schools, firms. And there are a lot of different kinds of legal services that we can distinguish. And so we want to think now about whether law could be more private. That is, the mixture of government and private actions in the law, we could move that more in the direction of private choice, especially regarding crime. So I want you to think about now the old Soviet Union. Back in the day, when the old Soviet Union basically ran the food industry. And in that world, the Soviet Union government would decide which food got produced where and how it was collected and how it was distributed and who got which kind of food. And so there was much less individual choice about which kinds of food you might want, when or where. It was just, this is what the government gave you. Now, in that world, food was very important, so officially you got some food rights, but it wasn't very well enforced in the sense that the government gave you whatever food it had. If it didn't have it, you didn't get it. And so even if you officially had rights, you would get whatever the government gave you. Now, I want you to use that as an analogy for the crime industry. So today, government runs the crime industry, and they decide sort of who gets investigated, who gets prosecuted, who gets punished, and how, and what sort of rights you have. And all of those things are decided centrally in a way that's not very adaptive or efficient. So if you think about the government-run food industry, you'd realize it's just not going to be very adaptive to individual circumstances. It's not going to be very innovative. It's not going to have very good incentives to be efficient. It's just going to be whatever it is. And that's kind of what the crime industry is like today. We haven't set up a very good system for adapting crime to individual circumstances or to innovate better ways to do things. And that's too bad, because maybe we should. And maybe then you'd actually have the rights you're claimed to have. Now, in history, the most ancient law we have it's the simplest, and that's the simple version where there's a judge and then there's two parties, an accuser and an accused, and the judge treats them equally, and they're each responsible for collecting their evidence and their arguments, and the judge will then make a decision on the basis of them treating them equally. And usually, although of course not always, the simple remedy is to make one side pay the other for damages if the accusation has turned out to be correct. And that may even be the origin of money, this sort of legal debt and payment. This ancient system worked for a long time, but in the last few centuries, we've moved toward a different kind of system, a criminal law system, which did exist in part in even very ancient worlds, but we've really ramped it up, and especially in Europe in the last few centuries. And this crime law system comes more from government. That is, the government decides what the laws are through legislature and agencies. It's more often about intentional harm. And then the government sort of goes and investigates the crimes. It decides to prosecute them. If they're found guilty, the government punishes. And the government basically just runs everything. Now, why did we invent this new criminal law system? Well, the idea is that the simple legal system we described before works pretty well if, say, your neighbor's tree falls on your yard, because you and your neighbor are connected together in a network of relationships. It was an accident. It's relatively easy to find your neighbor and to find evidence about the tree falling on your yard. This all makes the simple legal system relatively easy to handle. However, it turns out that all through history, some people specialized in hurting other people on purpose and trying to get away with it. And so think of bandits on the road between towns. Bandits are hiding themselves, they're hiding the evidence, they're making it hard to find them. If you do find them, it's hard to get very much out of them. And so that's the sort of thing where the simple legal system might have problems. Now, the ancient legal system would sort of try to deal with this by cranking up some parameters as high as it could go. So, for example, if they did catch you and found you guilty, then they might kill you. Or they might sell you into slavery in order to pay for the person who sued to prosecute you. They might go after your family instead of just you, clan liability. And these helped keep these sorts of more extreme situations at bay. But in the last few centuries, we've gotten reluctant to sell people into slavery or to take the money and the penalty out of their family. And then density has gotten higher. People live in much bigger cities, making it much easier for people to run away and hide. And that's part of why criminal law has been introduced and made much stronger over the last few centuries in order to deal with these problems. However, as you probably can realize, criminal law has a number of big problems. One of the biggest ones is the government can coordinate in the sense of governments running all these things, but these various government agencies can coordinate to be corrupted. They don't have to follow the rules that they're supposed to follow because they're the ones in charge of seeing whether the rules are enforced. So in criminal law, a lot of actors can excuse a crime. So there's not only sort of someone who reports the crime, but their boss can tell them to forget about it and make it go away. Prosecutor can decide they don't want to prosecute it. All the way along the way, lots of people can say, no, that didn't happen. And again, there's this blue wall of silence whereby if part of the government just doesn't obey the laws they're supposed to obey, the other parts of the government can just look the other way and ignore it because they don't have to do anything. And in the modern world, plea bargain threats are very powerful, and the government can basically threaten to bring their entire power against you unless you give in to them, and that's usually a pretty persuasive threat. So we all know that the government has these large powers and it could be corrupted, and so we have some weak ways in which we try to limit their power, such as through higher standards of proof, but mostly these don't work very well. And basically we have sort of this poorly adapted system where there's little innovation and little adaptation because the government just has a one-size-fits-all policy for everyone. All right. Well, the solution that I want to explore here, I call vouching. And the idea is, say in an ancient town, a stranger comes to town, and you might be reluctant to interact with them because this stranger could hurt you and then run away and then be gone, and you'd have no recourse to hold them accountable. So a common solution is to get someone in town to vouch for them. Someone in town says, I vouch for this stranger. If they run away and hurt you, I will be on the line. And that's a common solution that we've used all through history and still use today. We use it in computer security where somebody has to vouch for a patch. We have bonded contractors. If you want to get on a military base, somebody on the base needs to vouch for you. We have debt co-signers. And today in the automobile world, most people are required to get liability insurance such that if they have an accident and hit somebody else, then there'll be an insurance company that basically will vouch for them and pay for the accident if they can't pay. And the proposal here is to just do that for everything, to make everybody get a voucher who covers all of their legal liability, including criminal liability, not just for automobile accidents. The other part I want to add into this proposal, which is a more minor part, is the idea of bounties. So all through history, we've had this scenario, even in, say, the Old West, where we would post a bounty for whoever could capture and collect evidence to show that somebody was guilty. And then if they managed to convince the court that that person was guilty, then they would get paid the bounty. And even today in bail bonds, there are places in the United States where we have bounty hunters to catch people who escape from bail, and that tends to work more effectively than official police who are in charge of finding these people who escape. Okay, so I'm going to make a proposal here, but I want to be clear first about the scope of my proposal. Now, you should never try to change everything all at once. On the other hand, if you try to change something that's really small, people will get bored and not sure why they care. If you change everything all at once, it's not clear even how to think about it. So a proposal should set a boundary about what is changing, what is not changing. So my boundary here is that I'm going to not change how we decide what is a crime. I'm not going to change how we decide how an accusation is decided, that is the court process by which you make an accusation and have the procedure and then make a decision. And I'm not going to change how you decide the priorities for different crimes. There's going to be a way to set the priorities. But the things I am going to propose to change are how we punish people who are found guilty of crimes, how we set limitations on their freedom of privacy and movement, and how we decide the priorities of investigating various particular crimes. And those things I'm going to try to make more private. That is, those are going to move more to the private sphere. So my proposal has three main parts. So the first part is, as I said before, everyone must get a voucher, that is an insurance company, who stands ready to pay should they be found guilty of any sort of legal debt, including criminal debts. And this voucher is sort of on the hook for them, and they can't get rid of them easily. So we have to make sure everybody has to have a voucher, and that's important. We'll talk about that in a bit. Now that everybody has a voucher who can pay even large fines should they be found guilty of something, basically all but one fine can be punished by all but one crime is punishable by a fine. And the only exception would be the crime of not having a voucher, because then there isn't a voucher necessarily to pay. And the fine that's paid, part of that can go to pay, say, help the victim or for the government revenue, and a part of that goes to pay a bounty hunter, and that's the third part of the proposal. We basically empower many people to go look for potential crimes and collect evidence, and then if they can convince a court that someone is guilty, then that person's voucher has to pay the fine, and then that person gets the bounty hunter who proved the case. Now, the advantages of the system should be obvious, but the key point is we're going to cut corruption and bias of state officials. That is, these bounty hunters will actually not be willing to turn on each other and bring each other in if they are found guilty. We're going to have a world where lawsuits no longer have to focus on deep pockets. So in our world today, often if something goes wrong, you're advised to go find somebody near the bad thing that happened, where they have deep pockets and a lot of money. They say don't sue the person who actually caused the problem because they don't have much money. So now basically everyone will have a voucher with money to pay should they be found guilty of something. And so now you can more directly just sue whoever caused the problem, even if they're not rich. And of course, the main advantage here is this idea we're going to take crime from something like the old Soviet food system, where the government just decided everything and it wasn't very efficient or innovative or adaptive. And we're going to have this private vouching industry who will eagerly try to search for ways to make this whole thing more efficient. That is, vouchers are on the hook to pay a lot of money should their clients be found guilty of crimes. They don't want to pay a lot of money, and they will search for ways to reduce how often they'll have to pay. And we're going to empower them to write contracts with their clients, and the clients will agree to those contracts. The clients can choose whatever voucher they want on whatever terms, but once they've agreed to a voucher with certain terms, we will enforce those terms, and we're going to allow a wider range of terms than we allow for most other contracts. So, for example, today we punish crime with jail, say, or exile, and we will allow the voucher to punish their client with jail or exile or other sorts of punishments as agreed according to their contract. We will allow the client's contract with the voucher to specify their limitations on freedom and privacy, and we'll even allow the clients to choose co-liability, where they and a group of associates all say, if any of us is found guilty of these crimes, all of us can be punished, and that can convince the voucher that their risk will be lower and lower their premiums. And this whole system is now intended to replace jail and parole and probation and restraining orders because now we've got this vouching system. And basically, each client chooses their constitutional rights. That is, you decide which rights you're willing to pay for, which privacy rights and freedoms of movements, etc., that you're willing to pay for, and which sort of punishments you'd be willing to accept. And the rest of us no longer have to decide that. And today, actually, the majority of constitutional law issues that we agonize over are about the enforcement of criminal law. It's such a central and difficult area that we're all stuck trying to decide together. So this proposal I have on vouching, I'm sure you've thought of some problems. So let me just go through and mention a few of these potential problems. First of all, you might think, oh, this is just an excuse to let rich people do whatever they want because they can just cover the fines. But we can make fines depend on how rich you are. So if you're a billionaire and it costs $1 billion to kill someone, well, then you won't just go out and kill someone just because you feel like it. We can make the fines as large as you want. That's part of this system that I was not changing how we decide these priorities, we could set those priorities as in other ways. People might pick badly, and we might want to regulate the process by which people pick and make sure they're educated and knowing their choices, because choosing a voucher would be very important. If the vouchers were trying to collude, we could use antitrust enforcement to make sure that didn't happen, although it's not really a problem today in the law or the private investigator industry. Those are not industries where there's much collusion. We would want to make sure that everybody was vouched, and we'd want to have it sort of like license plates are in cars today. So because license plates are such an obvious thing, it's just really easy to tell that pretty much all the cars going on the street have a license plate, and we'd have something like RFID tags or some other mechanism would just make it really easy to check everybody was vouched. Of course, if we had bad crime laws, then the system would produce more effective enforcement of bad laws. And you might think that would be worse overall, but I have to limit my proposal somehow. I'm in this proposal finding ways to better enforce criminal law, and we talk in another poem about how to better choose criminal law. Obviously, there would be sometimes cases where there would be people who had a bad track record, maybe had committed a lot of crimes, and then they didn't have much money, and so the question is, what happens to them? And the answer is they would have to choose a contract that wasn't as favorable to them. So imagine there's a logging farm in northern Minnesota, and the loggers on the farm stay in a camp, except they can go into town once a week on an escorted trip on Saturday. Their emails are read, there's cameras all over the camp. Those people probably can afford pretty low premiums because the risk is very low. They've had to limit their freedom of movement and privacy in order to be able to afford the premiums, just like people today have to limit their freedoms in order to be on parole or something. That is, we don't necessarily trust them and we have to limit them more. All right, so in conclusion, we have a criminal law system today that's basically government run all the way through. It's not very efficient, adaptive, or innovative. And this is a proposal by which we could instead make a big chunk of that be chosen by private parties, by the individuals and their vouchers. And the key proposal is that everybody has to get a voucher to cover them, and we will enforce whatever contracts you make with your voucher. And then all crimes can be punished by fines, except for the crime of not having a voucher. And then bounty hunters can go catch people and find them guilty of crimes. And as a result, we break the blue wall of silence. That is, today, police can just break the law, and knowing that other police are in charge of enforcing the law, think they would get away with it. But now bounty hunters would not be willing to let off other bounty hunters because they'd want to get the money and not give it up. And that's my crime law proposal. Thank you for listening.